Should the descendants of slaves get compensation? US presidential candidates and the UK's main opposition party have been talking about that, so is it time that we got serious about reparations? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello from me, David Foster. It is Black History Month here in the UK, and the main opposition Labour Party says it wants to start a conversation about reparations, payments to the descendants of slaves. Not a new idea, but its supporters say they will not rest until their claims are dealt with.
Reparations for slavery is the idea that compensation needs to be given to today's descendants of the victims. How it would work is being considered in the UK and US. The debate around reparations recently ignited tension during the first US congressional hearing in a decade discussing it.
The greatest damage that enslavement did, besides the economic damage, besides the normalization of torture, of rape, besides the normalization of treating people as though they are things, is the institution in the American mind that black people are necessarily inferior.
And a senior MP from the UK's main opposition Labour Party, John McDonnell, said they could begin to pay reparations for the country's colonial past if elected, and that sharing green technology could be a way to do it. Reparations have been made before, to the Jewish community after the Holocaust, for instance, and like South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission after white rule apartheid. It can also include official hearings to document atrocities. Many in the reparations movement argue that the first step lies in educating society about the past in order to start the healing process. So what's stopping it from happening?
And our international cast is assembled. Marlene Ellis with me in the studio, project lead on Afriphobia and co-chair of the International Decade for People of African Descent. Kwaku, history consultant and community activist for the reparations movement. We go to Nashville, Tennessee, USA, once a slave state. Graham Hillard there, freelance journalist and associate professor of English at Trevecca Nazarene University. Then to Washington, D.C., Justin Hansford, law professor at Howard University. Graham, you first of all, 1 in 4 people in Tennessee, 1860, were slaves, and yet you say reparations, this is my note, you believe will heal nothing.
Well, I do have some concerns about what the long-term impacts of reparations would do. But I would say, first of all, the problem with reparations is that they're attended by a number of practical problems. The cost of reparations, frankly, make them impossible for any contemporary government to pay. Estimates that I've seen tend to be many times our gross domestic product, The second problem with reparations, practically speaking, is that they open the door for other groups who have a historical grievance to demand them. And finally, because we've had so much immigration after the end of slavery in this nation, because we've had so much intermarriage, we will all be subjected to the spectacle of the American government deciding who counts as black. I can't imagine anyone of any political stripe wants to see that.
OK, let's bring it back to the studio. And Justin, I'll come to you in just a minute. Marlene, those are some of the practical problems as Graham sees them. What do you think the moral issue is here?
Well, first of all, I don't accept those are practical problems that can't be overcome because America has a history already of paying reparations. And the problem you have here is the lack of will. Once you've got the will, you can sort out the practical problems of almost anything.
So what do you think the moral argument is?
Well, the moral argument is the argument that is already established in America with lots of reparations, that where you've had a breach of humanity, which slavery and the damage that's done to Africans is overwhelming. And in fact, they have a history of already making reparations on federal and state level to African Americans for the different experiments that they've had, for example. So the moral argument's already established. If you have a breach of humanity where you treat people less than human beings and you look at the repair that's necessary and the justice that's warranted, it's there. So this argument is about a lack of will, and nothing else.
Let's talk, Kwaku, if we can, about the practicalities on a financial level, which are also tied in with the idea of America as a melting pot, because you have so many people who inadvertently, they may be of African descent, have become involved in other sides of the business, and they would end up paying for this. Therefore, it would be impossible to work out who footed the bill.
I think that argument is coming from a standpoint of we shouldn't do anything. As Marlene said, if there's a will, we'll do. Complexity and practical issues does not stop us moving forward. If that was so, America, where it is, would not have been developed. It was the Wild West, but there was the will to go out. They went into space, so that is not the issue.
But the difficulty is you may end up with descendants of slaves helping to pay reparations when, in fact, they were the ones who were the victims 150, 200 years ago.
I do appreciate that there's some complexity to it, but nevertheless, that is not a reason not to start moving forward on this issue.
So it's the discussion you want rather than...
A discussion towards an end game, which is, by the way, compensation, just part of reparations. Let's be mindful of the argument we have. And if we're talking about compensation, that's one aspect of reparations. So I just want the viewers to be aware, because often people conflate reparations with the compensation, the financial aspect. So right now we're talking about the financial aspect. Yes, at some time we need to deal with it, but I don't buy his argument, because we can deal with it and find out who are the just people to receive that compensation when the time comes. We're starting from a point of view that we shouldn't do anything. So that doesn't move us forward at all.
Justin, several universities in the United Kingdom have made apologies. They've talked about setting up special centres that will deal with this kind of historical abuse. Churches have taken their lead, but governments have been very slow to follow. What's happening here?
Well, I do want to respond to this question as well, that there's not enough money. We know that our government, for example, set aside $18 billion for hurricane relief recently. It's not that we were all responsible for the damage of the hurricane. It's that our government knows that as a collective, we have agreed that we were going to take our tax money and serve the common good with it. And it is serving the common good to make our society more equitable and just by undoing the damage done by slavery. And
why would you undo the damage, though, by giving somebody a check?
Well, once again, we're not necessarily asking for checks to individuals.
Well, you brought up the money side of things with the hurricane.
Right. So, for example, there's a $23 billion gap between the between the amount of money that is in predominantly black schools in America and the amount of money that's in predominantly white K through 12 public schools. A good reparations plan would be to take $23 billion and give it to the school systems in these poor black neighborhoods that need books, that need teachers, that need resources. So those types of reparations that are systemic reparations for systemic harms are the way to move forward to provide justice. It doesn't have to be individual checks.
You see, OK, I understand what you're saying, that there are deprived neighbourhoods which could do with an injection of money, and particularly with the young people. But that should be done anyway, shouldn't it? This is nothing to do with reparations for the injustices of 150, 200 years ago. I'll go to you first, Graham, on that one. Then we can open it up. Anybody say anything they want to.
Sure, yes. So I think we should be clear about what we're speaking of here. If we're talking about increasing the amount of federal money that's going into programs to help disadvantaged communities, that's one argument. If we're talking about writing a check to the descendants of slaves whom we've identified through some kind of mechanism that I've never quite heard any specifics about, that's a different matter altogether. But I would invite our panelists and in fact the audience to think about some of the rhetoric that you're already hearing. We hear ideas like repair, or this is going to correct course, or this is going to be the healing process. We've already heard a little bit of it on this panel. Certainly you hear it in the rhetoric of politicians. And one of my arguments is that the people who make those promises no one could speak for the hundreds of millions of affected people around the world, the tens of millions of descendants of slaves in America. It isn't possible to say, if you do this, we will consider ourselves healed. This will be the end of the matter. It's just not that simple, because we're dealing with so many perspectives, experiences, expectations, etc.
Kwaku, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I'm shaking my head because it's a process that is not not one thing, right? It's a process. So how he can say that, I don't understand. I think he's just not interested in this issue. And that's part of the problem. Reparations is not just about those that are affected, i.e. the Africans. The Europeans and the oppressors were also affected. It's a mental thing in which, for example, Europeans do not understand white privilege, for example, right? The systemic advantages that they have. And that's where it's come from. He just is blinkered to the argument. I don't know what...
But this programme is about reparations, what you can do to make amends for the past. And one of the things I believe that you've suggested, Marlene, is effectively like a truth and reconciliation hearings, as they had in South Africa after the end of apartheid. I don't see that happening.
Okay, well, first of all, if we think of South Africa, you know, this rhetoric that we're hearing is similar to Margaret Thatcher used to say during the days of the boycott, we're not going to boycott South African goods because it won't be good for them. And so she opposed it along with Reagan, that it was this paternal idea that it's really, you know, it's too complex, it wouldn't be fair. But as Kwaku says, this argument that's been presented is not about, oh, it's too complex. It is just the narrative of, we don't want to do it. Look, the truth and reconciliation is important. The idea, with a bit more teeth, is important because, look, America is divided. The world looks entirely different if you're white to if you're African American. The only way we're going to understand each other's lives is if we have a direct conversation with each other, which is why reparations is about much more than reducing this to a bill. And it actually...
But that is part of it. You have to admit.
But as Kwaku says, it's the end. It's the end of the discussion, not the beginning. Yeah. Otherwise, we will betray the legacy.
Okay. So we have a long discussion, and there's a lot of mea culpa. It's my fault. But actually, it's not my fault.
Well, it's not about my fault.
There is a statute of limitations in this country where if you commit a crime, you can no longer be taken to court. Justin, you first, and Kwaku, because you're looking at me in absolute horror. Why should I pay for the sins of my fathers?
Well, it's more like paying for your own sins, because here in the United States, if you follow the Black Lives Matter movement, we have human rights violations taking place right now that the U.S. government is committing in the mass incarceration of Black people. So we don't have to go back to slavery for a justification for reparations. But keep in mind that reparations is something that happens all the time. Germans provided reparations for the Holocaust. Reparations are taking place in Colombia after mass human rights violations there. It's only when you talk about Black Americans that the issue becomes something that's so unimaginable. And it has to do with what we feel about Black people. We don't feel, as a global community, oftentimes, that Black people deserve the same sort of consideration and respect that other communities, like the Jewish people who got reparations for the Holocaust in Germany, deserved. And nobody said that, well, they're not going to be fully compensated and it won't solve things, there's not enough money. People just understood that when there was a mass atrocity, the people who are descendants of those who were harmed deserve some recompense.
Why not, if we're talking about the financial side of this, and Kwaku, you can come back to me to address the look of horror you gave me in just a moment, but why not, rather than writing somebody a cheque for X amount, which they will go and invest into a new home or books for their children or perhaps a holiday in the Florida Keys, why not spend this money enforcing international regulations which say that slavery is illegal when we know that slavery still exists? I went to Mauritania, a country where since 1981 slavery's been illegal. It's estimated there are still 43,000 slaves in that country. Why not put the money towards something that benefits the descendants of those slaves who are still slaves today?
Well, I think that would be only part of it. I mean, and this issue is much bigger than just African Americans, you know, and it is important, I think, to focus on what's on the continent and to reinvest into the continent and to reclaim the African continent.
Well, make Black African leaders enforce the laws in their own country. That's one of the things I'm saying.
Well, often the relationship that Africa has and how it behaves is directly related to the relationship it has with Europe. As Europe becomes more neoliberal, so Africa also catches that cold. So reparations is looking at the structure of this relationship we have with Europe and Africa, as well as individual ideas of payments. So it really requires, first of all, the conversation is not about blaming people.
I'm going to get Kwaku to come in because otherwise he'll have forgotten why he hated you 2 minutes ago.
Yes. Crime against humanity, I don't believe has a statute of limitations, and that's what we're talking about, crime against humanity. Those that are against reparations have tried to frame it in such a way that it says those that were there, their living experience should be compensated. There's something like what's known as generational trauma. So Marlene, who says that descendants in Jamaica who experienced slavery, there is an effect on her. But I'm disappointed we're talking about reparations and we focus so much on compensation. Reparations is about restitution. It's actually about saying no repeating those harms again. There's a whole raft of things.
So it's about education. Let's talk about education here.
Yeah, you want to talk about education because that is not give the obligation of payment. So that is easy. Anyway, the education. I will talk about it. I'll talk about it. This is what the conversation I want to have about education.
Yeah.
The education is not just about the Africans or those that suffered. It's also about the perpetrators and their descendants.
Are dead.
But you're a living proof. You're enjoying what is called the white privilege of that, the outcome of enslavement. So, yes, the perpetrators are dead. Those that suffered are dead. But we are the descendants, and those that are enjoying the fruits of that outcome. So the whole point of reparations is to try and get a level playing field. You know we don't have it, whether in the Americas, whether in the criminal justice system.
But you're talking, if I may say, Kwaku, about equality, which I believe would be absolutely fabulous. And I agree injustices exist. We're not talking with you about reparations. You're talking about making sure that the world is fairer.
That is part of the reparations narrative. No, you don't disconnect it. That's the point I'm trying to say. We have conflated the compensation with reparations and want to have a one-dimensional story. No, reparations is about the education, it's about the healing, it's about the making sure that we understand the wrongs that we've done and we're not going to repeat it. It's a whole raft of things.
Graham.
It seems like we're not exactly clear on what we're talking about, whether we want money in the form of checks or in the form of community investment. And until we clarify those topics, it's really of no use discussing reparations at all because it's just it's so broad a term that no one can make any sense of it.
Justin, go ahead.
One quick point. So the average Black American family has about $10,000 in wealth. The average white American family has over $100,000 in wealth. The question is, why is that? Is that because white families work harder or are more intelligent or are more ethical? No, it's because of the legacy of slavery and the legacy of housing segregation, where housing is the main generator of wealth in American society. Look, so the way we think about race is constructed by the huge disparities we face in our society.
Okay, so yesterday's ills have led to the inequality of today, and I think everybody agrees that the inequality of today is wrong. But let's go back to something that was mentioned at the very beginning of the programme, which was by Marlene, that reparations have already been paid in the United States. And I believe we've looked at it, to some extent to the Native Americans. Is that something that could be mirrored in the debate?
So we saw with Native American communities, there was an effort to provide some sort of reparations in terms of land and other types of programs for the genocide which was committed against them. So it's another example of the fact that reparations are part of American history.
But my point would be that they are still living unequal lives. They are still in deprived communities, apart from a few that make an awful lot of money out of gambling and casinos on Native American land. But the balance hasn't been shifted. So why would this do that?
That speaks more to the failure of the programs than it does to the community. So a better program would have shifted the balance and would shift the balance. You know, here in the 21st century, we know what allows people to move up in terms of the socioeconomic ladder. And so if we strategically invest in our communities in more intelligent ways, we would fix those problems. The Native American reparations types of things that we saw, these treaties that were done in the 19th century, weren't designed in any way to create some sort of more equitable system.
Justin, thank you very much. Marlene, I know you want to say something, but my point to this is that no matter what you do, it's a sop. It's not inevitably going to make any difference.
Well, it's a lack of imagination and a lack of vision. That is why it's confusing for some people. But we are not confused ourselves. You may feel confused. But look, let me give you an example of the opposite ends. In the abolition of slavery, compensation was paid to the slave owners. In Britain, we finished paying them in 2010. All taxpayers, including Africans, paid the slave owners for the privilege of us being slaves. Now, in current times, we have 101 British companies on the stock exchange in Africa looting minerals, natural resources from the Congo, the mineral coltan.
You're talking about something entirely different here, though, aren't you?
But this is the point. Look, how do you want to visualise reparations? What if you were even to say, let's have everybody stop looting minerals from Africa?
But you're talking about the rape of a continent, and that continent is being raped by some of the leaders on the continent, as well as international companies.
But that's not really true.
That isn't what we're talking about today.
If you think of reparations...
Reparations for slavery.
Think of the creativity of how you can think of what reparations is.
OK,
reparations
so number one on your list would be what?
I would have everybody stop looting from the continent of the African continent. That would be my number one.
That's not going to do very much for the descendants of slaves such as those from your family in Jamaica who were taken from Africa.
Well, if you take care of the continent first, if you start claiming agency over the African continent for the descendants of Africans, that is a very good start.
I don't know who would police it. I really don't, because that's for another day. Kwaku, number one on your list right now would be to do what?
Well, we all have a very limited lifespan, and we've got to do what we can in a lifetime. To me, my work is encouraging people about self-repair, and that comes with confidence, because I think the psyche and the confidence of Africans generally is so poor because of the Western influence over the centuries. So we do it through history. Okay. Marcus Garvey, for example, 100 years ago, was telling people about having African pride and stuff, and that is part of the process. I said reparation is a wide pot of things.
I think we've seen, haven't we, in the course of this discussion, that there is no answer. So, Justin, I'll just come to you for what would be the one lesson you hope your students at Howard University would take home about this subject?
Keep in mind that we spend billions of dollars in our government not based on something being somebody's fault. We spend billions of dollars on hurricane relief or building a wall, for example, because that's what the political will dictates. And when the political will in our country dictates the desire to make our society fairer and to move towards reparation for past harms, we will receive reparations. It's not impossible. It's very much attainable.
OK, and I will just go to Graham to say, take that point on board from Justin. I'm not suggesting, I don't know whether your descendants, your antecedents were in fact slave owners, but do you think it's something that you today, 2019, should be made to pay for as an American taxpayer, perhaps?
No, certainly not. And I reject completely the doctrine of collective guilt. It's a moral abomination. But I would say, if the question is, are we going to stop looting minerals from Africa? I'm on board with that policy position. So by all means, let's do that. I'm also on board for greater investment in minority school districts, for example. Let's level the playing field. But if the debate here is, should we be about the business of writing checks to the individual descendants of American slaves? No, we shouldn't, and we never will.
And I think we've proved on this programme, thank you very much indeed, Graham, Justin, thank you very much indeed. We've proved on this programme that it is not actually about that. Do you think, Marlene, Kwaku, very last words, do you think you're making progress?
I think we're going a little bit backwards and forwards. The consciousness of this is raising, but we're living in quite politically extreme times. But but I hope we gradually move closer and closer to something that's progressive, that really looks at having a better relationship with each other so that reparations can make sense.
And will that only happen if we talk about the past? Could we not just shake our neighbour's hand, whatever their creed or colour
come on.
and say, fantastic, Kwaku, I'm glad you're my mate?
No, come on, you live in the mansion. How did you acquire that mansion? So don't say I'm living in the shack and we shake hands. No, come on. I think the fact that we're talking about reparations and reparations being put on the mainstream agenda, that's important because often there's a long history of discussion on reparations, but it's always on the niche media. The mainstream doesn't cover it. So the fact that the Democrats, for example, are talking about it, it's important because we need to have a conversation to move this agenda forward.
Thank you very much indeed. I've thanked our two guests in the United States. I thank my two guests in the studio. The most important word is conversation. As long as people keep talking,
yes,
then it will stay in the public eye, and in fact, new ideas will emerge. And that's what this programme is all about. New ideas, conversation, stimulating guests, and an audience like you. Thank you for watching. We hope to have your company on Roundtable next time. For now, goodbye.